Keneal, Omega. Alpha Thorn spat the words, his heavy hand twisting violently in Paisley's hair. The unforgiving marble floor bit into her bruised knees as tears of absolute humiliation slipped down her pale cheeks. The pack jeered from the shadows, hungry for her broken submission. She squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a fractured sob. Minutes later, the grand hall's heavy oak doors splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. A monstrous roar shook the crystal chandeliers. Through the drifting wood dust stepped Silas, the brother she had thought dead for 5 years, now wearing the dark, blood-forged crown of the Northern Alpha King. "Get your hands off my sister," he snarled, his eyes glowing in absolute, murderous gold. The carriage wheels ground against the ice, a rhythmic, crunching sound that mirrored the erratic beating of Paisley's heart. Inside the velvet-lined cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine, iron, and the lingering copper tang of the slaughter. Silas sat across from her, a towering silhouette wrapped in heavy wolf pelts. His jaw was tight, his hands still stained with the blood of the men who had tormented her for years. He had ripped through Thorn's pack like a god of vengeance, pulling her from the wreckage of her old life. But freedom, she was quickly learning, came with a bitter price. Outside the frosted glass, the world had been swallowed by white. The towering evergreens of the lower valleys had given way to jagged, imposing peaks of black rock and eternal ice. They were climbing higher, leaving the safety of the known territories behind. "The High Council will not let this go, little bird," Silas murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely breached the heavy silence. "I slaughtered an alpha in his own hall. They will come for my crown, and they will come for you to punish me." Paisley pulled the thick furs tighter around her trembling shoulders. The phantom ache in her knees still burned, a cruel reminder of the marble floor. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, unused to speaking without permission. "To the edge of the world," Silas replied, his golden eyes dimming with a mixture of sorrow and fierce resolve. "To the Frost Peaks, the domain of the Winter King." A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold racked her spine. Alpha King Tyler. He was a myth whispered to pups to keep them in line, a ruler who bowed to no council, bound only by the ancient, brutal magic of the ice. It was said his heart was frozen in his chest, that his lands were a graveyard for the weak. "He owes our bloodline a debt," Silas continued, staring out into the blinding snow. "Sanctuary. But the ancient laws of his mountain dictate that I cannot cross his borders, lest it be seen as an act of war. You must walk the final mile alone." Paisley swallowed hard. The thought of stepping out into that howling white abyss was terrifying, but the memory of Thorn's cruel laughter was worse. She was an Omega, supposedly fragile, meant only to serve and submit, but beneath the bruises and the fear, a quiet, stubborn ember of survival burned within her. The carriage lurched to a halt. The wind howled against the wooden frame, a mournful, hungry sound. Silas stepped out first, the blizzard immediately whipping his dark hair. He reached back, his massive, calloused hands gently lifting her down into the knee-deep snow. The cold was instantaneous and brutal, biting through the heavy wool of her cloak, stealing the breath from her lungs. "Walk straight past the twin spires of black rock," Silas instructed, pointing into the swirling vortex of snow. His voice cracked, the Alpha King suddenly looking like the frightened boy who had been torn from her all those years ago. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Do not stop. Do not look back. The Winter King's wards will judge your intent. Be brave, Paisley." She nodded, too numb to speak. As Silas stepped back into the carriage, the door clicked shut, severing her final tie to her past. Paisley turned toward the mountain. The snow was a blinding curtain of diamond dust, the wind pushing against her like physical hands. She forced one foot in front of the other. Crunch, crunch, her breath plumed in ragged, rapid bursts. The cold quickly seeped into her bones. Her lashes froze, sticking together with every blink. The silence of the mountain was absolute, save for the roaring wind. She felt impossibly small, a fragile speck of life in a dead world. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her legs grew heavy, the biting frost giving way to a dangerous, lethargic warmth. The twin spires of black rock loomed ahead, jagged teeth tearing through the white canvas. She was almost there. Then, the wind died. The sudden silence was deafening. The snow suspended in the air, drifting lazily to the earth. The temperature plummeted further, the air tasting of pure ozone and deep winter pine. From the shadows of the black rock, a shape emerged. Paisley froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was a wolf, but impossibly large, the size of a warhorse. Its fur was the color of midnight and frost, thick and wild. Every muscle shifted with predatory grace as it stepped into her path. But it was the eyes that paralyzed her. They were not the eyes of a beast. They were a piercing, glacial blue, glowing with an ancient, devastating intelligence. The wolf lowered its massive head, exhaling a cloud of white breath, and locked its gaze onto hers. Fear, raw and primal, spiked through Paisley's veins. Her Omega instinct screamed at her to drop, to bare her throat, to submit to the overwhelming apex predator standing before her. Her knees buckled instinctively, the trauma of her past pulling her downward. Before her knees could strike the snow, the wolf released a low, chest-rattling rumble. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was a command. Stand. Paisley gasped, her muscles locking in place. She remained standing, swaying slightly in the biting wind. The massive beast took a slow, deliberate step forward. The snow didn't crunch beneath its paws. It seemed to part for him, honoring his presence. The sheer heat radiating from the creature fought back the freezing air, smelling heavily of crushed cedar, ozone, and a dangerous, intoxicating masculinity. The wolf stopped mere inches from her. She was barely as tall as its broad shoulders. Up close, the silver woven through its black fur looked like captured starlight. It leaned in, its cold, wet nose brushing against her frostbitten cheek. Paisley squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite, for the tear of flesh. Instead, the wolf inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of her fear, her lavender natural scent, and the lingering stench of Thorn's blood that stained her clothes. A sharp, angry huff blasted from its nostrils. The wolf pulled back, turning its massive body sideways to shield her from a sudden, violent gust of wind. It looked over its shoulder at her, flicking its ear toward the treacherous path ahead. Follow. Paisley didn't question it. The cold was finally claiming her, her vision fraying at the edges. She stumbled forward, walking in the deep, melted tracks the beast left behind. The wolf matched her slow, agonizing pace, acting as a living windbreak. Whenever she stumbled, a massive flank would press against her side, the radiant, almost searing heat of the animal keeping her upright. The blizzard raged around them, a chaotic symphony of howling wind and blinding ice. But within the wolf's immediate radius, there was a strange, heavy calm. Time lost its meaning. Her feet were blocks of lead. Her mind was floating away on a sea of white. Just as the darkness began to pull her under, the storm broke. They stood before a fortress carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. It was magnificent and terrifying, sweeping spires of black stone, towering iron gates, and high windows glowing with dim, amber firelight. It looked ancient, untouched by time, sleeping beneath a blanket of eternal frost. The heavy iron gates groaned open without a sound, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. Paisley took one step onto the smooth black stone of the courtyard. The wind instantly vanished. The sudden absence of the cold shock was too much for her battered body. Her adrenaline crashed. The world tilted. The black stone rushed up to meet her. She didn't feel the impact. She felt the sudden, desperate heat of thick fur, the sharp whine of a massive beast. And then, only darkness. When she woke, she was drowning in warmth. Soft, heavy velvet and thick furs pressed down on her, smelling deeply of sandalwood and smoke. The brutal cold was gone, replaced by the crackling symphony of a massive hearth fire nearby. Paisley opened her eyes, her lashes no longer frozen. She was in a cavernous room, the walls lined with ancient, leather-bound books and heavy tapestries. The amber firelight danced across the stone floor, chasing away the shadows. She was lying on an enormous, dark wood bed. She tried to push herself up, but her muscles screamed in protest. A soft gasp escaped her lips. "Do not move." The voice was a physical weight in the room, deep, resonant, and coated in ice. It sent a shockwave straight to her core, bypassing her mind and striking her very soul. Paisley turned her head. A man stood by the fire, leaning against the stone mantel. He was tall, built like a warrior forged in the harshest elements. His hair was dark, falling in slightly disheveled waves, and his jaw was covered in a rough shadow of stubble. He wore simple black trousers and a loose, unlaced tunic that revealed the hard, scarred planes of his chest, but it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. Glacial, piercing blue. The eyes of the wolf, Alpha King Tyler. He pushed off the mantle and stepped fully into the light. As his gaze locked onto hers, the heavy, silent air in the room seemed to ignite. A spark, sharp and undeniable, snapped between them, rushing through Paisley's veins like liquid fire. Her Omega wolf, battered and hidden deep within her soul, suddenly clawed its way to the surface, howling a single, earth-shattering word. Mate. Tyler stopped dead in his tracks. His massive hands curled into fists at his sides. The muscles in his jaw locked as he stared at her, his chest rising and falling with sudden, ragged breaths. The silence in the grand chamber was deafening. Save for the spitting embers in the hearth, Paisley lay frozen beneath the furs, her heart hammering a frantic, wild rhythm. Mate. The word echoed in her mind, terrifying and beautiful. For an Omega, finding a mate was supposed to be a fairy tale. But to be mated to the Winter King, a man bound by ancient laws, a ruler whose domain was built on absolute strength, she was a broken thing, carrying the scars of another pack's cruelty. She wasn't fit for a king. Tyler remained completely still, a statue of muscle and restraint. His glacial eyes tracked every minute shift of her body, every shallow breath she took. The pull between them was a physical tether, humming with raw, crackling magic. It was a gravitational force, demanding they close the distance. Yet, he fought it. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of a heavy oak table near the bed. The ancient laws of the Frost Peaks were absolute. The Winter King could not afford weakness. His mate was meant to be a warrior, an alpha bloodline to anchor the turbulent magic of the ice. Taking a fragile, traumatized Omega would not only defy the mountain's magic, it could destroy them both. He tore his gaze away, staring into the flames. His jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to snap. "You are safe here." Tyler finally spoke, his voice lower, rougher than before. It was the sound of a man keeping a beast on a very short chain. "Silas's debt is paid. The High Council cannot touch you within my borders." He didn't mention the bond. The omission hung heavy in the air, a silent rejection that made Paisley's chest ache with a sudden, profound hollow. She lowered her eyes, her old instincts taking over. She was meant to be small. She was meant to be quiet. "You, Alpha," she whispered, her voice trembling, instinctively baring her neck in submission. A low, dangerous growl ripped through the room. Paisley flinched, pulling the furs up to her chin, expecting the strike. But it didn't come. Instead, Tyler crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping right beside the bed. The heat rolling off him was intoxicating, smelling of sharp winter air and dark woods. "Do not bare your throat to me," he commanded softly, the harshness gone from his tone, replaced by a strained, agonizing gentleness. "And do not call me Alpha. Not like that. Here, you kneel for no one." He reached to the bedside table, picking up a small ceramic bowl filled with a pale, glowing ointment. The scent of crushed mint and healing herbs filled the space. "Your old pack," Tyler said, his voice tightening as his eyes fell on the dark, ugly bruises blossoming along her collarbone and shoulders marks left by Thorne's brutal grip. The room's temperature plummeted a few degrees, frost creeping across the edges of the window panes in response to his rising fury. "They will pay for what they did. But first, you must heal." He hesitated, his large hand hovering over her bare shoulder. The air between his skin and hers seemed to warp and shimmer with the suppressed mate bond. "May I?" he asked. The King of the North, asking permission from a broken Omega. Paisley looked up into his eyes. The ice in them was gone, melted away by a fierce, protective fire. Slowly, she nodded, letting the heavy fur slide down to expose her bruised shoulder. The moment his rough, calloused fingers grazed her skin, a jolt of electricity shot through them both. Tyler's breath hitched, his eyes darkening to a stormy, midnight blue. Paisley gasped, a rush of warmth flooding her cold limbs, chasing away the phantom pains of the marble floor. He moved with painstaking care, spreading the soothing ointment over the dark purple bruises. His touch was feather light, a stunning contrast to his massive, lethal hands. For the first time in her life, Paisley didn't feel fear under the hands of an alpha. She felt a profound, overwhelming safety as his thumb traced the curve of her shoulder blade, moving toward a raised silver scar she had borne since birth. The air in the room suddenly shifted, the moment the ointment and his touch met the old scar. The silver line ignited. A soft, ethereal, moonlit glow erupted beneath Tyler's hand. The light pulsed, spreading across her skin in intricate, geometric patterns, ancient runes that Paisley had never seen before. Tyler snatched his hand back as if burned. He stared down at the glowing crest now illuminated on her skin. The mark of the lunar heir. A bloodline thought wiped out centuries ago. A bloodline that held dominion over the very magic of the earth. He looked from the glowing mark to Paisley's terrified, confused face. The Winter King dropped to one knee beside the bed. Not in submission, but in absolute awe. She wasn't just an Omega. She was the mountain's salvation. The glowing runes on Paisley's shoulder pulsed in time with her racing heartbeat, casting a soft, pearlescent light across the heavy stone walls. The geometric lines were beautiful, intricate, and utterly alien to her. She instinctively reached up to cover the mark, her trembling fingers grazing the warm, humming skin. Tyler remained on one knee, his glacial eyes wide, stripped of all the fearsome control he usually commanded. The silence between them was thick, heavy with centuries of lost history. "What is this?" Paisley whispered, her voice fracturing. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. "What did you do to me?" "I did nothing," Tyler breathed, his voice a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath them. He slowly raised his gaze from her shoulder to her eyes. "That mark, it has been asleep in your bloodline, waiting." He stood, towering over her once more, but the menacing aura of the Alpha King had evaporated. In its place was a quiet, desperate reverence. He paced toward the roaring hearth, running a hand through his dark hair. The firelight caught the silver scars on his forearms, illuminating the brutal history of a man who had fought for every inch of his frozen kingdom. "For 300 years, the Winter Kings have been cursed," Tyler spoke, staring into the flames. "The magic of the Frost Peaks is wild, ancient, and deeply volatile. To rule here is to absorb that ice into your very soul. Eventually, the cold consumes us. We lose our humanity. We become nothing more than monsters of the blizzard." He turned his head, looking at her over his broad shoulder. "Unless we are anchored." Paisley pulled the furs tighter, her mind spinning. "Anchored by what?" "By the lunar heirs," he replied softly, closing the distance between them again. "Omegas born not to serve, but to balance. Your bloodline commands the earth, the warmth, the very tides of the magic we wield. You are the hearthfire to our blizzard. You were the original queens of the north." The words hung in the air, impossible and staggering. Queens. Omegas. In Thorn's pack, Omegas were dirt, punching bags, breeders. To be told she was a queen, a savior to the most terrifying alpha on the continent felt like a cruel trick. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and fast, spilling over her lashes before she could stop them. The weight of her past collided violently with the revelation of her present. She curled inward, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She wasn't a queen. She was just Paisley, who had been forced to kneel on cold marble, who still flinched when a door closed too loudly. A heavy, warm weight settled onto the mattress beside her. Tyler didn't speak. He didn't offer empty platitudes or alpha commands. He simply reached out, his massive arms wrapping around her trembling frame, and pulled her against his chest. Paisley froze for a fraction of a second, but the deep, rumbling purr emanating from his chest shattered her defenses. It was a sound of pure comfort, a lullaby woven from cedar and ozone. She buried her face into the crook of his neck, her hands instinctively clutching the unlaced fabric of his tunic. He held her fiercely, his chin resting on the top of her head, his large hand gently stroking her hair, completely ignoring the tears soaking his skin. For the first time in 5 years, Paisley allowed herself to completely shatter, safe in the arms of the beast that the world feared most. Outside the thick fortress walls, the wind howled a triumphant song. But deep within the ice, something else pierced the night. A high, long, and mournful note echoed through the valleys. Tyler went rigid against her. The purr in his chest abruptly cut off, replaced by the low, dangerous hum of a predator preparing for slaughter. He pulled back slightly, his glacial eyes darkening to the color of a bruised midnight sky. "The Vanguard horn," Tyler growled, his jaw locking. "The High Council has found you." The heavy wooden door to Paisley's chambers clicked shut, leaving her alone in the sudden, agonizing quiet. Tyler had commanded her to stay, his voice leaving no room for argument, before he disappeared down the winding stone corridors to rally his guard. For 3 hours, she paced the length of the room. The luxurious furs and the crackling fire felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Every instinct hammered into her by Thorn screamed at her to hide under the bed, to make herself as small and invisible as possible. But the glowing runes on her shoulder hummed with a strange, dormant heat. "You were the original queens of the North," Tyler's words echoed in her mind. If she was a queen, she would not cower, while her mate, her savior, faced the vanguard alone, moving with a newfound, quiet resolve. Paisley approached the heavy oak wardrobe at the corner of the room. Inside hung garments, woven not for a fragile Omega, but for a woman of the Winter Court. She shed her blood-stained, tattered clothes. The phantom ache in her knees was gone, the herbal ointment and Tyler's touch having worked a near miraculous healing. She pulled on a thick, dark blue tunic that fell to her mid-thigh, embroidered with silver threads that matched the color of Tyler's wolf. She strapped on sturdy leather leggings and knee-high, fur-lined boots. Around her shoulders, she fastened a heavy cloak of stark white direwolf fur. When she caught her reflection in the tall, standing mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The bruised, terrified girl from the marble floor was gone. In her place stood a woman whose eyes held the quiet, stubborn resilience of a winter flower breaking through the frost. She pushed open the heavy chamber doors. The stone corridors were a labyrinth of shadows and pale moonlight streaming through high-arched windows. The castle felt alive, vibrating with the frantic, organized energy of impending war. Servants and guards rushed past her. But unlike Thorn's pack, they didn't push her or avert their eyes in disgust. As they caught sight of the white cloak and the silver embroidery, they paused, bowing their heads in deep, silent respect before hurrying on. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. Paisley followed the echoing sound of heavy boots and the sharp clatter of steel. The corridor opened up onto a sweeping, high balcony overlooking the massive iron gates of the courtyard. The wind immediately whipped at her hair, the brutal cold returning, but the hum of her magic pushed back against the chill, keeping her blood warm. She gripped the stone balustrade, peering over the edge. The courtyard was lined with Tyler's warriors, massive men and women, shifting nervously, their eyes fixed on the portcullis. But standing alone, a dozen paces ahead of his army, was the Winter King. Tyler wore no heavy armor, only dark leather and a sweeping black cloak that swallowed the light. A massive broadsword rested casually against his shoulder. He looked utterly relaxed, a king perfectly at home in the jaws of violence. Beyond the iron gates, the snow was stained with the flickering orange light of 100 torches. The vanguard of the High Council. They were heavily armored, their banners whipping violently in the wind. At the front of their ranks sat a man on a massive, armored stallion, Alpha Kalen, the council's chief executioner, Tyler of the Frost Peaks. Kalen's voice boomed over the howling wind, laced with arrogant authority. "By the decree of the High Council, you harbor a fugitive. Surrender the Omega, known as Paisley, or we will consider your sanctuary broken. And your borders forfeit." Down in the courtyard, Tyler didn't flinch. He slowly lowered his broadsword, the tip resting against the black stone with a metallic clink. "You come to my gates," Tyler called back, his voice not a shout, but a deep, resonant rumble that carried over the wind with terrifying ease. "You demand blood from my stones, and you threaten my borders." Tyler stepped forward, the air around him suddenly dropping in temperature, a visible aura of frost spreading across the ground from his boots. "The Omega is under my protection," Tyler growled, his eyes igniting with a lethal, icy blue light. "If you want her, Kalen, you will have to dig through my heart to get her." Up on the balcony, Paisley's breath hitched. He was going to war for her, against the entire council. A warm, golden heat flared to life in her chest. rushing through her veins. "You are a fool, Tyler," Kaelin sneered, drawing a gleaming longsword. The vanguard soldiers behind him shifted, readying their shields and drawing their bows. "You break ancient treaties for a broken, used Omega? She is nothing, a plaything meant to be broken." The words hit Paisley like physical blows, a terrifying echo of Thorne's cruel taunts. But before the paralyzing fear could take root, an earth-shattering roar erupted from the courtyard. Tyler didn't draw a weapon. He didn't issue an order. His body violently contorted. The sound of snapping bone and tearing muscle echoed off the stone walls. But it wasn't a sound of agony. It was a sound of absolute, predatory liberation. Within a second, the man was gone. In his place stood the monstrous, warhorse-sized wolf of midnight and frost. The wolf snapped its massive jaws, the sound like a steel trap closing. The temperature plummeted so drastically that the torches of the vanguard soldiers sputtered and hissed, fighting to stay lit. Frost rapidly climbed the iron bars of the gate. Tyler lunged forward, throwing his massive weight against the iron portcullis. The heavy metal groaned and shrieked in protest, bowing outward under his sheer, monstrous strength. The vanguard's front line stumbled backward in genuine terror. "Fire!" Kaelin screamed, his horse rearing in panic. Dozens of bowstrings snapped. A hail of black-fletched arrows arched over the iron gates, raining down toward the courtyard. Tyler stood his ground, letting out a defiant, chest-rattling roar, ready to take the volley to protect his pack behind him. "No!" The scream tore from Paisley's throat, raw and desperate. She didn't think, she only felt. The golden heat in her chest exploded outward, racing down her arms and pooling into her palms. The silver runes on her shoulder burned with a blinding, lunar light, visible even through the heavy fabric of her tunic. She slammed her hands down onto the stone balustrade. A pulse of pure, concussive silver magic erupted from the castle walls. It swept over the courtyard like a tidal wave of moonlight. As the magic collided with the descending arrows, the projectiles froze midair. The wood splintered, the iron tips turning to dust, before they all shattered into harmless, glittering snow that drifted softly to the ground. Complete, stunned silence fell over the mountain. Down below, the massive ice wolf snapped his head up, his glowing blue eyes locking onto the balcony. Paisley stood there, the wind whipping her white cloak around her. Her eyes, usually a soft, terrified hazel, were now glowing with a brilliant, unearthly silver light. The magic hummed in the air, a warm, fragrant scent of blooming lavender and rich earth that completely neutralized the oppressive frost. Outside the gates, Kaelin dropped his sword, his face drained of all color as he stared up at the balcony. He wasn't looking at a broken Omega. He was looking at a myth made flesh. The lunar heir. A vanguard soldier whispered, dropping to his knees in the snow. Tyler shifted back into his human form, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Paisley with a mixture of raw awe and furious possession. He turned back to the vanguard, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet promise. "You dare raise weapons against the Queen of the Frost Peaks?" Tyler demanded, the ice in his voice matched only by the violent promise of death. "Run back to your council, Kaelin. Tell them the North has remembered its magic, and if a single one of your soldiers steps foot within my domain again, I will not just freeze your blood." He looked up at Paisley, his jaw setting in a fierce, protective line. "We will bury you beneath the mountain." The vanguard didn't need to be told twice. Panic broke their ranks. Kaelin desperately wheeled his horse around, fleeing into the howling blizzard, his soldiers scrambling over themselves to escape the wrath of the Winter King and his newly awakened queen. As the sounds of their retreat faded into the wind, Paisley's knees finally buckled. The silver light faded from her eyes, the exhaustion of the magic crashing over her. But she didn't hit the stone. Strong, familiar arms caught her before she could fall. Tyler gathered her against his chest, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent like a drowning man finding air. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely, his heart thundering against hers. "I've got you. My queen." Tyler carried her away from the balcony, his strides long and urgent, yet his hold on her was impossibly gentle. The pack parted for him without a sound, their eyes wide, reflecting the lingering starlight of her magic. They weren't just stepping back out of fear for their terrifying alpha. They were bowing. Massive, battle-hardened wolves dropped to one knee, baring their throats to the fragile Omega nestled in his arms. Paisley buried her face against his collarbone, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. The scent of ozone and crushed cedar enveloped her, acting as an anchor in the storm of her own sudden power. He didn't stop until they reached his private sanctuary, a circular room at the very peak of the tallest tower, encased almost entirely in thick, enchanted glass that overlooked the endless, glittering expanse of the frost peaks. A massive bed layered with heavy pelts dominated the center, and a fire roared in a colossal stone hearth, fighting back the chill of the altitude. Tyler laid her down upon the furs, instantly pulling a thick wool blanket over her trembling form. He didn't step back. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his large hands carefully framing her pale face. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver straight down her spine. Paisley slowly opened her eyes. The silver glow was entirely gone, leaving her eyes their soft, natural hazel, brimming with exhaustion and fear. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just wanted to protect you. I didn't mean to." "Shh," Tyler interrupted, his thumbs gently wiping away a stray tear that traced her cheekbone. "You have nothing to apologize for. You wielded the magic of the earth. You protected my pack. You protected me." He leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers. The physical contact sent a jolt of pure, undeniable electricity through them both. The mate bond, so long suppressed by Tyler's iron will and Paisley's trauma, was now fully unspooled, humming between them like a taut wire. "You are my mate," he breathed, the admission finally tearing free from his chest. It wasn't a claim of ownership. It was a surrender. "My anchor. My queen." Paisley's breath hitched. For 5 years, the word mate had been a source of terror, a shackle she expected a cruel alpha to lock around her throat. But with Tyler, the word felt like a warm hearth in the dead of winter. It felt like home. Slowly, tentatively, she reached her hand up from beneath the blanket. Her small fingers traced the rough stubble along his jawline. Tyler let out a ragged sigh, turning his face to press a kiss into her palm. The absolute devotion in that single, tender gesture shattered the last of her walls. "Tyler," she whispered, testing the feel of his name on her tongue. It tasted like power and safety. "I am here," he replied, his glacial blue eyes darkening as they locked onto her lips. "I am bound to you, Paisley. In this life and the next. The ice in my veins has bowed to your fire." He didn't push. He hovered, the apex predator waiting for her consent. Completely submissive to her quiet strength, Paisley tangled her fingers in his dark hair and pulled him the rest of the way down. When their lips finally met, there was no violence, no brutal claiming. It was a slow, agonizingly tender exploration. The kiss tasted of winter wind and sweet lavender. As he deepened the kiss, a rush of pure, golden warmth exploded from Paisley's core, rushing through the bond and straight into Tyler's chest. For the first time in 300 years, the cursed Winter King felt truly, profoundly warm. The silver runes on her shoulder flared to life once more, not in a defensive blast, but in a slow, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of his heart against hers. Their souls braided together in the silence of the tower, forging a bond that no council, no army, and no curse could ever break. The peace of the tower lasted for 3 days. 3 days of discovering the soft, quiet corners of each other's souls. Tyler showed her the ancient texts detailing the lunar airs, teaching her to channel the humming magic beneath her skin. Paisley learned that her power wasn't just destruction, it was life. With a touch, she coaxed frozen seeds in the castle's dead greenhouse to bloom into vibrant, resilient winter roses. She was healing the mountain, just as Tyler was healing her, but the real world could not be held back forever. On the morning of the 4th day, a deep, resonant horn blasted through the valley, entirely different from the vanguard's shrill warning. Tyler, who had been sitting with Paisley by the fire, went perfectly still. A slow, terrifying smirk curved his lips. "Your brother," Tyler murmured, standing up and reaching for his sword. He certainly took his time. When they descended to the courtyard, the heavy iron gates were already grinding open. Silas rode in alone on a massive warhorse, his dark armor battered and scarred from fresh battles. He swung down from the saddle, his golden alpha eyes scanning the courtyard until they locked onto Paisley. He froze. He had sent a broken, terrified girl into the blizzard. The woman standing before him now stood tall, wrapped in the white cloak of the Winter Queen, her eyes clear and her chin raised. Tyler stood at her side, his massive frame angled slightly. A subconscious shield, though they both knew she no longer needed one. Paisley, Silas breathed, closing the distance in a few rapid strides. He dropped his helmet, reaching out as if afraid she were an illusion. "I'm here, Silas," she said softly, stepping forward to embrace her brother. The scent of blood and exhaustion radiated off him. "You," Silas pulled back, his eyes catching the silver embroidery of her cloak and the subtle, confident shift in her posture. He looked up at Tyler. "The bond is sealed. She is my queen," Tyler stated simply, his voice leaving no room for negotiation or doubt. "Good," Silas grunted, a grim shadow falling over his face. Because Kaelin didn't run back to the council to cower. He ran back to rally them. "They are marching on the U.S. peaks. Tyler, all of them. The High Alpha himself leads an army of 5,000 shifters. They mean to wipe out your pack, kill me for Thorn's death, and cage the lunar heir." The courtyard fell dead silent. 5,000. Tyler's pack numbered barely 500 warriors. The odds were a slaughter. Tyler's jaw locked, his hand dropping to the pommel of his broadsword. The mountain will not fall easily. The narrow pass will funnel their numbers. "It won't be enough, Tyler," Silas warned, his golden eyes filled with grim reality. "They have siege weapons. They have fire magic." Paisley looked between the two massive alphas. The fear that used to paralyze her tried to claw its way up her throat. But the steady, burning heat of the runes on her shoulder pushed it down. She was not the prey anymore. She was the anchor. "They won't breach the gates," Paisley said, her voice cutting through the tension like silver glass. Both men turned to look at her. "You are strong, little bird," Silas said gently, "but you cannot hold off an army of 5,000. "I don't have to fight them, Silas," Paisley replied, her eyes flashing with a sudden unearthly silver light. She turned to Tyler, her mate, her king. "You told me the lunar heirs command the earth and the tides of magic. The frost peaks are my domain now. I will not let them touch what is mine." Tyler stared down at her, the glacial ice in his eyes completely melting into absolute, blinding devotion. He reached out, his calloused thumb tracing her cheek. "Then we stand together," Tyler vowed, his voice a low, sacred rumble. "The Alpha King and the lunar heir. Let them come." The ground began to shake before the sun rose. The High Council's army poured into the jagged valley like a river of black steel and torchlight. War drums beat a relentless, suffocating rhythm that echoed off the frozen peaks. Tyler and Silas stood at the vanguard of the Winter Court's forces just inside the iron gates. They had both shifted. Silas was a massive, scarred russet wolf, his teeth bared in a snarl. Beside him, Tyler's midnight and frost form was terrifying to behold. A god of winter ready to drown the world in blood. But high above them all, standing on the pinnacle balcony of the tallest spire, was Paisley. She wore no armor, only her dark blue tunic and the flowing white cloak. The wind whipped violently around her, but she felt no cold. Her eyes were closed, her hands pressed flat against the ancient, black stone of the balustrade. She was reaching out, sinking her awareness past the stone, past the snow, deep into the very bedrock of the mountain. She felt the ancient magic sleeping there. It was cold, jagged, and bitter from centuries of blood. "Wake up," she whispered to the mountain, pushing the golden warmth of her soul into the stone. "Protect your children." Down in the valley, the High Alpha raised his sword. "Burn them out," he roared. A volley of flaming arrows and spheres of volatile, red magic arched through the dark sky, aimed directly at the wooden structures within the fortress walls. Paisley snapped her eyes open. They were glowing like twin moons, a brilliant, blinding silver. The runes on her shoulder flared, the light bleeding through her clothes and illuminating the entire balcony. She threw her hands forward, before the fire could touch the castle. The very air above the courtyard shattered. A dome of translucent, shimmering ice, woven with threads of silver lunar magic, materialized out of thin air. The flaming arrows struck the dome and hissed into nothingness. The spheres of red magic detonated against the barrier, the explosions rippling across the surface like water. utterly failing to break through. A gasp of shock rippled through the council's army. "Charge the gates!" The High Alpha bellowed, desperation edging into his voice. Thousands of wolves surged forward, a tidal wave of fur and fang ready to crush the Winter Court's defenses. Tyler let out a monstrous roar, bracing to meet the charge, but Paisley wasn't finished. She didn't want a slaughter. She wanted submission. Drawing in a deep, agonizing breath, she pulled the magic from the mountain not to freeze, but to move. She slammed her hands down onto the stone. The valley floor violently groaned. The ground 50 yards ahead of the council's charging army suddenly ruptured. A massive, jagged wall of black rock and solid ice shot up from the earth, towering 50 feet into the air, stretching across the entire width of the pass. The charging wolves slammed their brakes, skidding in the snow, crashing into one another to avoid slamming into the impenetrable wall that had just cut them off from the fortress. Complete, terrifying silence fell over the valley. The war drums stopped. Paisley stepped up onto the stone ledge of the balcony, fully visible to the army trapped behind the wall of ice. Her voice, amplified by the magic of the mountain, echoed like a thunderclap across the peaks. "You come to my home to spill blood." Paisley's voice was the fury of the winter storm and the unyielding strength of the earth combined. "You mock the ancient laws. You will find no prey here today, only the mountain. And the mountain does not bow." She raised one hand, her fingers curling into a fist. The massive wall of ice and stone groaned, shifting forward slightly, a physical threat that promised to crush them all into dust. The High Alpha's horse reared, throwing him into the snow. He stared up at the glowing figure on the balcony, terror replacing his arrogance. He recognized the power of the old world, the power that the councils had spent centuries trying to breed out of existence. He was utterly, hopelessly outmatched. Slowly, trembling with defeat, the High Alpha pushed himself to his knees in the snow. He bowed his head. Behind him, the vanguard soldiers dropped their weapons. One by one, the massive army of 5,000 wolves sank to the ground, baring their throats not to an alpha, but to an omega. Down in the courtyard, Tyler shifted back to his human form. He looked up at the balcony, his chest heaving, his glacial eyes filled with a pride so fierce it physically ached. His mate had won a war without taking a single life. She had broken the curse of the frost peaks. The silence in the jagged pass was absolute, heavy with the terrifying weight of surrendered pride. 5,000 vanguard soldiers, the undisputed elite of the High Council, knelt in the biting snow. Their weapons lay abandoned, their heads bowed toward the magnificent, terrifying figure standing on the high balcony. Paisley did not revel in their submission. Where Thorn would have laughed, where Kalen would have drawn a blade to secure his dominance, she felt only the steady, thrumming pulse of the mountain's heartbeat matching her own. She exhaled a long, measured breath, the silver light slowly receding from her eyes to leave behind her natural warm hazel. The massive wooden doors of the balcony creaked open behind her. Tyler stepped out into the freezing wind, his dark cloak billowing around his broad shoulders. He crossed the stone floor, his movements silent and lethal, stopping just behind her. He didn't crowd her or attempt to take command. Instead, he rested one massive, calloused hand flat against the small of her back. It was a physical tether, a silent promise of absolute support. "They wait for your judgment, my queen," Tyler murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a comforting warmth radiating through her chest. "Open the gates," Paisley commanded softly. Tyler turned his head slightly, giving a sharp, subtle nod to his lieutenant in the courtyard below. The heavy iron portcullis shrieked in protest as the chains engaged, lifting the massive barrier that had separated the Winter Court from the rest of the world for centuries. Paisley turned from the ledge. Together, she and Tyler descended the winding stone staircase, leaving the safety of the fortress. Silas followed closely behind, his golden eyes scanning the kneeling army with lingering, protective suspicion. When they stepped out onto the snow-packed ground of the valley floor, the vanguard visibly flinched. The sheer, overwhelming aura of the Winter King, combined with the intoxicating, lavender-laced scent of the lunar magic, radiating from Paisley, forced the kneeling wolves to press themselves even closer to the earth. They walked the 50 yards to the towering wall of black rock and ice that Paisley had summoned. She raised a single hand. The silver runes on her shoulder flared gently beneath her cloak. The massive wall groaned, a sound like a dying leviathan, before it split down the center. The ice dissolved into glittering mist, and the black rock sank seamlessly back into the earth, revealing the High Alpha still kneeling in the snow just a few feet away. High Alpha Magnus was a man whose entire life had been defined by absolute, tyrannical power. His silver hair was perfectly braided, his armor immaculate. Yet his hands shook as he stared up at the Omega he had come to cage. "You stand before the Winter Court," Tyler's voice boomed across the valley, sharp as shattered glass. "Speak, Magnus, or the mountain will swallow you whole." Magnus swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the towering lethal Alpha and the seemingly fragile woman at his side. He kept his head bowed, an act of supreme humiliation for a man of his station. "We surrender," Magnus choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The High Council acknowledges the sovereignty of the Frost Peaks. The ancient pacts are unbroken. We will leave your borders." "No." Paisley's voice wasn't loud, but it carried with a supernatural clarity that reached the ears of every soldier in the pass. Magnus's head snapped up, genuine terror finally breaking through his arrogant facade. Silas tensed, his hand dropping to the hilt of his sword, ready for violence. But Tyler didn't move an inch. His thumb simply stroked a slow, reassuring circle against Paisley's spine. "The ancient pacts allowed you to turn a blind eye while your alphas treated omegas like property," Paisley continued, taking a deliberate step forward. The snow seemed to melt away from her boots, small green shoots of winter grass pushing through the frost in her wake. "Those pacts allowed men like Thorn to build empires on broken bones and silenced voices. The old laws are dead, Magnus, buried beneath the snow today." She stopped just an arm's length from the kneeling High Alpha. The air around her smelled of deep earth and blooming lavender, a stark contrast to the sharp tang of his fear. "You will return to the capital," Paisley decreed, her tone leaving no room for negotiation or debate. "And you will rewrite the laws of the territories. No pack will hold an Omega against their will. No Alpha will strike a mate without facing the full wrath of the Winter Court. The Frost Peaks are no longer just a sanctuary. We are the judgment. If word reaches my mountain that an Omega is bleeding for your pride, I will not just raise walls of ice to stop you." Her eyes flashed with a brief, blinding silver light. "I will bring the mountain to your gates." Magnus paled, realizing the sheer, apocalyptic reality of her threat. She wasn't just claiming a territory. She was dismantling his entire societal structure. But looking up into her eyes, backed by the terrifying power of the Winter King and the Northern Alpha, he knew he had absolutely no choice. It will be done, Queen Paisley," Magnus whispered, pressing his forehead to the snow in ultimate submission. "Take your army and leave," Tyler commanded, his voice dripping with icy disdain. "Before my patience thaws." The vanguard didn't hesitate. They scrambled to their feet, their discipline shattered, eager to put as much distance between themselves and the awakened magic as possible. Within minutes, the vast, terrifying army was nothing more than a retreating line of dark figures vanishing into the driving snow of the lower pass. The silence that returned to the valley was entirely different from the silence of their arrival. It was not a silence of fear, but of profound, unshakable peace. Silas stepped forward, a wide, weary grin breaking across his scarred face. He dropped to one knee, exactly as the vanguard had done. But this was an act of familial love and deep respect. "You did it, little bird," Silas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all. Get up." "Silas," Paisley said softly, a genuine smile touching her lips as she reached out to pull her brother to his feet. She embraced him tightly, burying her face in his fur-lined shoulder. "You saved me first. You pulled me from the marble, and you made sure no one else will ever have to kneel there again," Silas replied, pulling back and looking between her and Tyler. He extended a hand to the Winter King. Tyler took it, their forearms clasping in a brutal, iron-strong grip that solidified the alliance between the North and the Frost Peaks. "My pack needs their alpha," Silas said, stepping back toward his waiting warhorse. "But the North is united now. If you ever need me, Tyler, send word. The mountain stands with you, Silas," Tyler promised. They watched as Silas rode out, his silhouette disappearing down the winding mountain path. When they were finally alone in the courtyard, the heavy iron gates closing behind them with a definitive, ringing clack, The adrenaline of the day finally began to drain from Paisley's veins. She swayed slightly, suddenly aware of the deep, aching exhaustion settling into her bones. Channeling the mountain's magic had taken a massive toll. Before she could stumble, Tyler was there. He swept her up into his arms, holding her effortlessly against his broad chest. "I've got you," he whispered, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He carried her back up the winding stairs, past the bowing guards and the awestruck servants, until they reached the quiet sanctuary of the glass-encased tower room. The fire in the hearth was roaring, casting a warm, amber glow over the heavy pelts of the bed. Tyler gently laid her down, shedding his heavy cloak before sitting beside her. He reached out, his rough fingers carefully unlacing the top of her tunic to check the runes on her shoulder. The intricate geometric patterns were no longer glowing. They had settled into a soft, shimmering silver hue against her pale skin. "You were magnificent," Tyler murmured, his voice thick with a reverence that bordered on worship. His glacial blue eyes traced the lines of her face as if memorizing a sacred text. "I have spent 3 centuries preparing for war, and you ended one with a whisper and a wall of ice." Paisley reached up, her small hands cupping his face. The rough stubble of his jaw scratched pleasantly against her palms. "I didn't want to be a weapon, Tyler," she whispered softly. "I just wanted to protect my home. To protect you." Tyler leaned into her touch, a shuddering breath escaping his chest. "You did more than protect me, Paisley. You saved my soul." He shifted his weight, moving to lie fully beside her on the furs. He pulled her flush against his side, tangling their legs together. The sheer, overwhelming heat radiating from his body was a stark contrast to the icy legend of the Winter King. "You're warm," Paisley noted softly, a small, wondrous smile touching her lips. She rested her hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thumping of his heart beneath the scarred muscle. "I am," Tyler agreed, his voice dropping to a husky, intimate octave. "For 300 years, it felt like I was drowning in a frozen lake. I couldn't feel the fire. I couldn't feel anything but the cold and the rage. But when you touched me..." He leaned down, brushing a soft, lingering kiss against the silver crest on her shoulder. The ice shattered. He trailed kisses up her neck, each touch sending a renewed jolt of warm, golden magic through the mate bond that tethered their souls. Paisley arched into his touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. The trauma of her past, the memories of Thorn and the marble floor, felt like a distant, faded nightmare. Here, in the arms of the most feared predator on the continent, she was entirely safe. She was entirely cherished. Tyler hovered over her, his eyes dark and stormy with desire, but utterly devoid of the cruel dominance that defined other alphas. He was waiting, always waiting for her permission, her pace. "I love you," Paisley whispered, the words slipping out easily, true and undeniable. A low, rumbling growl of pure affection vibrated in Tyler's chest. "And I am yours, my queen," he vowed against her lips. From this winter, until the end of days, as they finally surrendered to the quiet, passionate pull of their bond, the magic of the mountain responded in kind. Outside the thick glass windows, the eternal blizzard finally broke. For the first time in centuries, the heavy clouds parted, allowing the brilliant, silver light of the full moon to wash over the frost peaks, bathing the newly awakened kingdom in a warm, ethereal glow. The winter sun finally broke over the jagged peaks, casting a warm, golden light across the snow. Paisley stood on the balcony, the silver glow faded from her eyes, replaced by a deep, profound peace. Tyler stepped out behind her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him, the warmth of his body a perfect contrast to the crisp morning air. The vanguard was gone, scattered back to the lowlands with a tale of the Winter Queen that would ensure the frost peaks were never threatened again. The curse was broken. The ice in Tyler's veins was forever tempered by her light. She was no longer a broken Omega forced to kneel, but a queen who had brought an entire kingdom to its feet. Bound by fate, healed by love, they looked out over their eternal, untamed world.